Good evening. Hello, and a warm welcome to everybody tuning in to my YouTube station, Smita Sharma Journalist. Right at the outset, a gentle reminder that if you like the content on the station, do share and also make sure to press that bell icon notification on your screens so that you're alerted every time we go live with fresh content. And continuing with our focus here on the big presidential election and the results that have stunned the world in many ways. Because perhaps even if people were expecting Donald Trump to win, just the fact that he has won with such large numbers, also in terms of popular votes, getting the Republicans getting control of the Senate. So, what does Trump 2.0, it's a non consecutive second term, really mean for India and South Asia in particular? To talk about it, I'm joined by Suhasini Haidar. She is the diplomatic editor for The Hindu, a prolific writer, author, and also a fantastic article yet again this morning in The Hindu that you would have read on what Trump 2.0 essentially means for India. Make sure to pick that copy up. Thank you so much, Suhasini, for finding time here on our show. If you could unmute yourself.
Thank you, Smita, for having me on your show. And what an interesting week it's been.
Absolutely. I mean, not a dull moment at all. But let me just start by asking you, because, we have seen Prime Minister Modi being amongst the first world leaders who actually not just who had a telephonic conversation with President Donald Trump. And it's interesting to see that there were two readouts that were put out by the Prime Minister's office. What did you really make in terms of the substance of those conversations?
Well, I think there's no question that it was a very warm conversation. After all, Prime Minister Narendra Modi and US President Donald Trump have certainly a record of a good bonhomie between them when in Trump 1.0, if you like. He and Prime Minister Modi met at least twice in 6 months. In fact, held two public rallies together, which I think is definitely something very unusual for two leaders of such big countries to do. They seemed to have a rapport. India has, in general, looked at the Trump years as also very productive in terms of India-US relations. Of course, subsequent years have been very good. Preceding years were also very good. There's a sense that the India-US relationship has grown year upon year for the last 25 years, actually, but that the Trump era was particularly good and positive for India-US ties. So I think that's what came through in the two readouts. Certainly, the first one that came out was perhaps a little more unfiltered, if you like. It talked about what the two men had discussed and seemed to be quoting Mr. Trump ad verbatim when he said that Prime Minister Modi was a magnificent man and that India was a magnificent country.
And that the two could work together towards world peace.
And world peace was in capital letters, interestingly. Also that he said that Prime Minister Modi was loved by the quote unquote the whole world. And it had more details of what Mr. Trump had said in obviously what was a personal conversation. But I think the Ministry of External Affairs has subsequently put out its own readout, making clear that the two countries have a lot to deal with as well. And they looked forward to the next 4 years of the Trump administration.
What are you picking up as perhaps, of course, the next few weeks, we will see the transition happen. We will see President-elect Donald Trump taking oath of office, coming in. Any signals right now to suggest that, will there be people in his team that will be a continuation from Trump 1.0 in any way? Has the bench strength kind of improved, perhaps become a little bit more stronger and resilient to the unpredictability of the commander-in-chief Trump himself?
Well, Smita, we've been trying to get a sense of who is going to be up in the Trump cabinet. What we do know is two or three things. The first is that unlike 2016, where perhaps Mr. Trump himself had not expected to win, he did not really have much of a transition team in place. He did not have ideas. If you read the latest Bob Woodward book, it talks about how difficult it was for him to find each candidate for Secretary of State, for Secretary of Defense, and really reach out to them after he had been elected. In this scenario, from what we understand, the Trump team has been hard at work for at least a year now. And there have already been rounds of interviews unofficially with various candidates, perhaps for these posts. So what we do expect is, unlike the Trump era, where if you remember, it was like a revolving door. I think there were 3 or 4 Secretary of States in those 4 years. There was a number of national security advisors. There was a number of defense secretaries. What we also know is not too many of those would actually be back, because subsequent to leaving the White House and the administration, all of them have said that Mr. Trump was actually not somebody they would want to work with
It
again.
was a nightmare also to cover the administration. I mean, for journalists like us, we were waking up after different time zones and seeing somebody had been sacked and the information was coming through on X. Then of
Correct.
course Twitter.
And I think that is something that I think the Trump team has made clear it doesn't hope to do around this time around. So that's certainly there. There are many names running around, and I think speculating about them would be pointless, simply because that we'll find out who they are in due course. But from what we understand, names of prominent Indian Americans over there, prominent think tank personalities, prominent generals as well, who could be expected in the post. I think at the bottom line, what we're looking at is a Trump presidency, which will be an extremely centralized, extremely focused presidency from the top. And when it comes to India-US ties, we're likely to see that relationship between the two leaders perhaps leading the way on the priorities ahead. We can talk about those priorities, because I think there are
Yes.
positives and negatives.
Yeah, I was going to, in fact, lead into that. At the moment, what do you see perhaps as the two, three key? Because there's so much happening even on the world stage, whether it's the West Asian conflict to Russia, Ukraine. Do you think, keeping in mind, the expectation that at least Trump will do something different in terms of the Russia-Ukraine war going forward, will that be a top of the conversation between New Delhi and US right now, or will it really be about economy? It will be about trade?
Well, certainly on the Russia-Ukraine front, Mr. Trump has made it clear, one, that he intends to engage Russian President Vladimir Putin, which will be a departure from the past few years with Mr. Biden. Secondly, he is unlikely to put the kind of pressure the US put on India to somehow curtail its ties with Russia, and that will be a relief from the Indian point of view. What will be part of his conversation with Mr. Modi on that? Possibly, if they do see the possibility of, in the future, a kind of peace deal or even a ceasefire being set up in Ukraine, Prime Minister Modi could contribute to that. And you might hear more about that. But I think the real meat of the relationship is in the bilateral. And that's where people are looking with both sort of hope and some concern about what could follow. Because on the one hand, Mr. Trump has made it clear that he would like to drive more trade with India. But then on the other hand, he's also made it clear he believes India is a quote unquote serial abuser, is a major abuser of what he calls trade tariffs. And he will look to cut Indian tariffs in a number of spheres. In his first term as well, he was extremely ruthless on this count, regardless of his friendship, either with the prime minister or with the country. Mr. Trump put India under new tariffs, took India to the WTO on a number of disputes that only just got resolved between them. Also, essentially, hectored India on a number of specifics, like the Harley-Davidson tariffs, on export bans of medicines like hydroxychloroquine. So we saw that kind of push on trade and reducing tariffs from the Indian side, as well as a free trade agreement with the US, which was
How much, just to remind our viewers and to jog their memories, Suhasini, the fact that Mr. Trump, while on the one hand, on critical technology, we did see a lot of transfer happening after giving that STA level 1 sort of authorization to India. But on the same time, when it comes to bilateral trade, taking India off the GSP list, how did kind of that impact India really?
No, it was a huge impact on Indian exporters when India was taken off the generalized system of preferences, the GSP status that exporters from India have had. It's something many developing countries receive certain waivers from the US on. And for a long while, the Indian government thought they may be able to get that GSP status back. Mr. Trump certainly did not change his decision, and Mr. Biden was not able to either reverse that decision. But it has had that impact. And it has also shown us that Mr. Trump is willing to take those very, very tough kind of decisions, regardless of how close the friendship is. The second part of what he will push for is more Indian investment in the United States, more jobs actually coming back to the US and showing that how India-US cooperation can produce jobs back home. If you remember, he really made a push for the Mahindras and the Tatas to come and set up their factories in the United States. That's clearly the opposite of what India is trying to do with the Make in India program. And we heard External Affairs Minister Jaishankar there in Australia voice some concerns about the kind of protectionist moves that a Trump administration might take. The second part is going to be investment in U.S. Enterprises like energy. In his term, if you remember at the Howdy Modi event with Prime Minister Modi and President Trump in Houston, they announced a massive MOU, $2.5 billion by Petronet India, investing in a to be constructed driftwood LNG plant in Louisiana. That MOU never fructified. A year later, in fact, it was shelved completely, but it was the product of that kind of pressure. So he may not put pressure on India, on Russia, perhaps to cut its ties from Russia, but he will want India to buy more energy, what he calls gold, liquid gold, from the US, especially because he's made it clear that he intends to, again, quote unquote, drill, baby, drill in the US. So we are likely to see on the energy front him taking a very different tack, say, from the Biden administration, which was more interested in renewable energy and funding India's climate change transition. And perhaps some more of the strong arm tactic, which, if you remember, he was able to get India to completely zero out its oil imports from both Iran and Venezuela, because he said otherwise he would put India under sanctions. So there are pluses and minuses. There's a very warm relationship. But there are also concerns about the extent and the strong arming that Mr. Trump can go to when he wants something.
And before I, shift the focus to also, in fact, in taking the conversation forward to South Asian challenges, one last question on the bilateral front, because while you have large sections of Indian diaspora celebrating the Trump victory and thinking that perhaps it's only, the sword is only going to be hanging as far as illegal immigration is concerned, that those people are going to be repatriated. But we're already seeing reports that how at least 1 million Indians who are waiting for their green cards, that they would be in jeopardy because he's planning to take away the rights that if you're born in the US, that's why you get a citizenship. During his last term also, we saw a crackdown even on skilled, in fact, visa caps as well. So that should be something where we should be striking a note of caution right now.
Well, to begin with, Smita, I do have to wonder if India can, sort of make immigration a linchpin of its foreign policy, in a sense. The idea that Indians getting visas in various countries, particularly in Western countries where they have a path to citizenship, is slowly actually being degraded, even though Mr. Trump has been at the forefront of fighting against what he sees as immigration or illegal immigration. The truth is many Western countries are now clamping down on the kind of entries that they give foreign skilled personnel. Therefore, India is looking, as a result, at more and more of these mobility agreements. I assume that there will be some kind of a negotiation with the United States on this as well. Now, when it comes to actual American visa categories, you're right. in his first tenure, Mr. Trump cracked down on H-1B spouses, if you remember, allowing the spouses of H-1B holders to come there. He's also cracked down, as you said, on certain skilled skilled Indian exports as well. And then now this new plan, it's still a plan right now, to drastically cut the numbers of citizenships that they would give out by virtue of birth. By just saying that's not a category. If your parents are not American citizens, or one of your parents are not American citizens, then you can't automatically get an American citizenship purely by virtue of birth. That will really change things, and I'm not sure it has been thought through and will actually be implemented. I think what you have to also wonder about is whether the atmosphere in America, because this is something that was of concern to a lot of Indian students as well as professionals who went there. Is Trump 2.0 going to repeat that atmosphere, which is very unfriendly to non-Americans in a certain sense, but actually in general to make foreigners in that country feel very unwelcome? And I think that is going to be a concern. But I really genuinely feel that the Indian government is going to have enough on its plate in terms of negotiating on a number of fronts without necessarily negotiating more for Indian visas. In fact, you would possibly remember that in the period from 2016 to 2020, visas and immigration facilities and all the rest of that was not high up on the Indian government's list. And subsequently, too, we have seen, as the Biden administration stepped up the deporting of Indian citizens, it's now something that even the Biden administration almost did as a matter of pride. If you remember, just 2 weeks ago, putting out this statement saying that they had found all these Indians and they were deporting them back to India, and they'd conducted these removal flights. I think in general, there is a very negative atmosphere towards immigration, whether it's illegal immigration. It does spill
Not
into
just in US, I think it's across the world. World leaders, regardless of which party, which ideology they represent today, they are being forced, in a way, it's becoming a political compulsion to come down hard on immigration, on illegal immigration for sure, and with, of course, some implications also for skilled migration. But, in the just last 10 minutes of this conversation, Suhasini, I would like you to touch upon the differences, in particular in South Asia. I mean, you've had Indians actually, sounding almost ecstatic that President Trump during his campaign specifically spoke about Hindu minorities in Bangladesh, and that he's not really had that kind of a relationship with Muhammad Yunus, the interim caretaker Prime Minister of Bangladesh, like, he was feted in a way by President Biden. How is Bangladesh and South Asia really going to, or it's not going to really be a priority area for President Trump and his team?
Well, I think in the last President Trump tenure, South Asia had a slightly larger imprint in the United States simply because the US troops were still in Afghanistan. We're now seeing a Trump administration come in without the encumbrance of having US troops there. Therefore, Pakistan may not be much of interest to Mr. Trump at this time. And on the Bangladesh issue, I think you have to read very between the lines to that tweet, which was very, very significant from Mr. Trump, put out on Diwali, but actually targeted completely at the Bangladesh interim regime. Now, it could be for a number of reasons. We do know that the Hindu American Foundation, for example, is a donor to Mr. Trump. And he has been very keen to make inroads with what is called the Hindu American constituency, but actually is really Indian Americans. And we did see in this election Indian Americans who by far in the past traditionally would have been at least 80% voting for Democrats. This election was probably about 70% for Kamala Harris and the rest for Mr. Trump. A definite increase in the numbers of Indian Americans interested in the Republican Party as well as inside the Republican Party. And you can see the number of people of Indian origin who are part of Mr. Trump's inner circle. The name of Kashyap Patel is doing the rounds right now as NSA. If it does, it means that someone right in the White House. But even in the Biden administration, we had seen some of those. Now, the second part of that tweet and the very targeting of the Bangladesh interim regime for failing to protect Hindu minorities in the country. And that's something India has raised as well. So obviously, there is some amount of, I should say, satisfaction in New Delhi that Mr. Trump has those concerns on his mind as well. I think you have to look at Mr. Yunus, the chief advisor of the interim regime's own background, and the fact that he has been very close to Democrat leaders, the Clintons, the Bidens, the Obamas as well. In fact, Mr. Obama wrote a letter to Mr. Yunus just after he took power. He had given him the Presidential Medal of Freedom when Mr. Biden was vice president. And you saw the reception Mr. Yunus got from Mr. Biden in September when
And
he
a warm
visited.
hug that made it to the photos.
Absolutely. Mr. Trump at that time is understood to have made the point that Mr. Yunus was with his rivals. And I'm sure that that somewhere there remains with Mr. Trump. And even though there's been a very, very cordial letter sent out by the Bangladesh chief advisor to Donald Trump as of yesterday. I'm sure that there is some concern in Dhaka about where this is going to lead, because in the last few months, they have seen a real surge in support from the US when it comes to things like its IMF and World Bank commitments, in trying to shore up the Bangladeshi economy and all of those areas. So I think you have to read between the lines on that Trump tweet, but it is significant.
I just do want to flag one issue here and get a quick reaction from you, Suhasini, which some people may have missed, because in a first, the Indian representative in Afghanistan, JP Singh, who's the Joint Secretary on the Pakistan, Afghanistan, India, Iran desk, he actually met with Mullah Yaqub, who's the son of Mullah Omar and the current defense minister in the Taliban regime. The timing is very interesting of JP Singh meeting. I mean, even on the bilateral front, what is the sense that you get from this meeting, Suhasini, or what's happening there?
Well, it's significant from 2 points of view. One, the new engagement with the defense minister, and as you pointed out, Mullah Yaqub is the son of Mullah Omar, the founder, in a sense, of this version of the Taliban. And the fact that New Delhi is kind of getting more and more comfortable with the Taliban regime is significant at this time. But I think it's also significant that India made the point that this was about Chabahar, and this is about broadening the cooperation between India and Afghanistan's regime, because India does not recognize the Taliban regime yet, nobody does, over trade through Chabahar, as well as aid that India wishes to send to Afghanistan through Chabahar port. Why this is significant is because it was in the Trump tenure that we saw Trump really doubling down really on India to cut all its oil from Iran and to cut its ties with Iran in that sense. However, Mr. Trump did give India that carve out on Chabahar, saying that as long as Chabahar is being used for some kind of support to Afghanistan, which in those days was still under President Ghani, America would allow India to use that Chabahar port in Iran. It's significant, I think, because New Delhi is testing the waters to make sure that a Trump administration would continue to support India's forays through Chabahar, through Iran, even though the Republic government in Afghanistan no longer exists. Even though Mr. Trump is expected to get very tough on ties with Iran again once he takes office in January. So I think what you're seeing maybe is just a little bit of exploration being done, diplomatic exploration by New Delhi in this meeting with Mullah Yaqub, which of course has been noticed in many capitals. And in fact, the Ministry of External Affairs even issued a statement about it.
Just a final question, Suhasini, on the kind of differences that we have seen between India, of course, Canada in particular, over the killing of Nijjar, but also the sort of botched up assassination attempt of Panun, with one Indian in fact in custody, the judicial case going on in the US, and US being a part of the Five Eyes allies for Canada as well. Do you think it will have, anyways, in the US, the treatment of the case has been different. The way it has been handled, a little definitely more matured than the way Justin Trudeau's gone into the public and spoken about it. Do you think it will kind of continue to be an important friction point between Delhi and DC?
Well, I think there are three parts to this. One, the cases themselves, the alleged assassination attempt against Panun in the US, and the actual killing of Nijar in Brampton in Canada last year. Those two cases are now headed for their trial situations. We expect to hear trial dates both in New York as well as in Canada fairly soon in the next few months, and they will take their own course. What evidence they produce, whether India is willing to accept or not, those will all take their own course. I don't think that there is much presidential executive intervention really allowed in that. Second, though, the kind of pressure India has seen from maybe all the Five Eyes, but particularly from the State Department, when it comes to Canada's allegations, and Canada's allegations have become more and more quite unusual and even bizarre in some cases, where we've heard the Canadian government saying that they not only I think Indian government agents were involved in the killing of Nijar. They then made the Indian diplomats, including the Indian High Commissioner, a person of interest, leading to them leaving Canada after that. And then the latest allegation that Indian Home Minister Amit Shah is actually also someone that they think signed off on the killing of Nijar. Now, all of those allegations each time have been, in a sense, backed up by the State Department. And we've heard the US government essentially saying, we are very concerned by these allegations. We take them very seriously. We would like India to investigate. We would like India to cooperate. There is a certain sense, and we've been speaking to officials about how they see this playing out now. And their point has been that they expect the Trump administration not to speak in this kind of language, maybe, and not really push India too much on these cases. They also expect that a Trump administration will really crack down hard on Khalistani extremism. This has been a long-term demand of India's for decades now. And seeing, more and more Indian diplomats, people of Indian origin being attacked, not just in Canada, in the US as well, where the Indian consulate in San Francisco was targeted by Khalistani extremists. They are expecting the Trump administration to take these much more seriously. While they did not perhaps come out as strongly against the Biden administration as they have against the Trudeau administration over this, the fact is there was some concern that the Democratic establishment was not taking these concerns seriously, and instead was kept coming up with the idea of transnational repression by the Indian government. They don't expect to see that kind of noise coming out of a Trump administration. So that's really the second part. The third part is the fact that Mr. Trump and Mr. Trudeau really don't have a very good relationship. And Mr. Trudeau was on the record saying earlier this year that Trump 1.0 was not easy for us in Canada, and Trump 2.0, if he's elected, will not be easy for us either. They did hammer out a trade deal between them. They did. There was, a G7 kind of meeting as well. But at the end of the day, Mr. Trump and Mr. Trudeau really did not hit it off, and there was constant tension in that relationship. Now, as we discuss this, it may be that we don't actually have to discuss it even perhaps a year from now, because Canada is headed for general elections. Mr. Trudeau is not expected to win them, given by his current polling figures. And a new government in Canada, particularly the Conservatives, Pierre Poilievre, if it's him, would be, in fact, much more closely aligned to a Republican government in the United States. India also has been making their outreaches to the Conservatives. So I do think that maybe we're discussing this right now, but perhaps in a year, it will not be as much of an issue.
And of course, these are early days also in terms of even being able to predict anything about the Trump presidency, because the one thing that is a constant with Trump is his unpredictability. And, if reading the accounts of all the people, his relatives who worked closely with him, the one thing that always comes to mind is that he does operate, his MO does seem to be one of chaos, one of fear. We'll have to see how it pans out this time. But there are a lot of good signs, of course, when it comes to the larger India-US relationship, particularly under the Trump-Modi dynamics. Many thanks to Suhasini Haidar for joining me here in this conversation. Like always, a pleasure listening into your insights.
Thank you. Thank you, Smita, for having me on.
Thank you. And as far as the audiences who tuned in, I think one of you had a lot of questions asking about trans women, Project 2025. Suri, I know you came in late into the conversation, but with Suhasini, I was essentially focusing on South Asia and India and the foreign policy challenges. Your questions I have noted, but I will try and take them, of course, from another guest who will be up soon talking more about the domestic challenges for the US under Trump 2.0 presidency. So stay tuned to this space for more conversations like these. Meanwhile, thank you so much for tuning in again to all of you. Goodbye and take care for now.